He was called King Rowan of Athris, a name spoken with reverence in the marble halls of his kingdom, a shape of power that cast a visible shadow across the court. Everyone knew the stories of his unbending will and iron decisions, how he had wrested the northern marsh from bandit lords, how he had quelled rebellions with careful strategy rather than needless slaughter. The crown he wore fit him like armor, and his people believed him born to rule. And yet, beyond the armor lay something else, a scarred tenderness he kept locked away. He had loved once, and the memory of that love lay behind his eyes like an unhealed wound. In the years since, he had hardened, wearing detachment as a sovereign would wear robes. Rumors whispered that he sought a marriage for the throne's sake, not for the heart. He would bring an heir, consolidate alliances, and that would be that Dot, the House of Larksong, was small and poor by the standards of nobility. Its lands ragged at the kingdom's edge, its keep low and moss-grown. It specialized in honesty and quiet work, growing flax, mending sails, teaching village children how to read the moon. No grand tournaments were held there. No gilded feasts called noble names. Yet from that unassuming house came Mara. Mara was the sort of woman whose life had been tempered by necessity. She was not a lady of satin and lace. Her fingers were calloused, her hair often dusted with flour or soot, and the neighbors joked that she wore practicality like a second skin. She'd been raised on common sense and laughter, on long mornings in thin sunlight and evenings spent repairing what life broke. She had learned to measure happiness in small, bright things, a loaf baked without burning, the warm weight of a child's hand in hers, the way the river looked when morning fog lifted. When people spoke of beauty, they meant other things, grace, a bloom, a mirror's reflection. Mara believed beauty also lived in the stubborn kindness of an ordinary life. When summons swept through the kingdom asking for brides to present themselves to the court part of a political marriage to seal peace with neighboring lords, Mara did not expect to be noticed. The Larksong family could not resist an offer that promised security and a small pension that would keep the little house from falling into ruin. Her mother insisted. Her sisters teased. Mara agreed because the world had taught her that duty was often the most honest path at court, where brocade and snowfall of jewels made even the chandeliers jealous. Mara felt small as a candle flame within an ocean of stars. They brought her to an antechamber of the palace where women of every station were gathered, some coy, some bold, some carved into the exact image of tradition. She held her chin high, though her stomach was a knot of grief and wonder. A page led them through marble corridors until they reached the throne room. That room had voices like trumpets. It had a history that spoke of wars and treaties, and at its heart sat King Rowan. Rowan rose to greet the assembly in a manner that made all murmurs hush. He was a man shaped by duty-broad shoulders, jaw like chiseled stone, and eyes that scanned as if each person present were a map he might examine for weaknesses. He did not linger on faces. He offered a curt nod, a protocol that warmed no one. When the court offered presentations, each family bore their most flattering mask. He observed the display of fashion and the slow, practiced smiles of mothers. But when Mara was presented, she did not wear the court's mask. Her dress had been chosen more from necessity than vanity, clean, plain, stitched to be modest. Her hair, tied back, had small wild sprigs braided in remnants of the walk from the carriage to the palace. There was an unadorned honesty about her that startled some, and when her eyes met Rowan's, he felt a flicker of something like curiosity, or perhaps recognition of a long-quieted sincerity. He did not choose her at first sight. He could have courtship, and his world was often a transaction, and he had reasons to prefer alliances over unpredictability. But fate, that persistent trickster, arranged a small injury. A child of the court, laughing and running between columns, stumbled and was about to fall when Mara's quick hands caught him. The child's shriek turned into a bright chatter, and the king's eye, ever watchful, registered the shift. That simple action catching a child without a thought to splendor moved something in him in the weeks that followed. As the kingdom held counsel over matters of harvest and border, Rowan found reasons to see Mara again. She was not a lady of intrigues. She did not flatter his decisions nor propose elaborate plans for the throne. Instead, she spoke plainly about repairing roofs before winter, about the sting of losing a neighbor to fever, about making the best of what you were given. Her voice, when she spoke of small-town problems, carried the weight of someone who had stitched her own life together. Rowan found himself listening not as a king to a petition, but as a man to a neighbor in uncomfortable, unfamiliar position. The court murmured about the odd match. Songs were written on the tongue of the tavern-goers, of the king who favored the peasant, of the rumors that he sought rebellion against tradition. The noble houses fumed quietly in marbled halls. A king's marriage was not merely personal. It was the kingdom's ledger. The day comes when pomp must become action. Rowan announced their betrothal as a strategic unity. It would send the message that his reign acknowledged the common folk. That unity mattered. He expected gratitude from the people and grumblings in the nobles' chambers. He did not expect the tide of scorn he found in private. The noblewoman whispered that he had chosen an ugly duckling, a woman who would never fit the court, who would embarrass the crown. He heard the rumors that perhaps he had been charmed, or that some secret must exist behind her plainness. That angered him in a way he had not expected. It was not the insult he minded, but the assumption that one's worth could be measured by appearances. Mara, for her part, accepted the wedding the way she accepted chores because it needed to be done and because it would protect those she loved. She felt fear thread around her, fear of losing herself, of being eaten by gold and etiquette. Yet she also felt a small, stubborn hope that if she could keep one small thing unchanged, she could hold the life she loved somewhere between the penance and the heraldry. Preparations were made. Gowns were adorned. A veil, long as an oath, was woven in a chapel by elder women whose hands remembered the threads of many brides. There were lessons, mercifully brief, in courtly manners for Mara. How to sit politely, how to mask blunt reactions with what passed for grace. She tried and failed and tried again. Rowan watched, and sometimes when the tutors left, he would linger and help her with the smallest things, the proper tilt of a goblet, the gentle inflection that turned a curt sentence into something softer. He found he enjoyed the intimacy of teaching, an unexpected intimacy that did not require confessions or candles. On the morning of the wedding, the palace was a tempest of color and gold. Windows threw light into the vaulted hall, and banners snapped like applause. Noble houses arranged their displays as if to show the world their wealth and rank. The people, too, lined the streets outside, some with garlands, some with tests of skepticism in their eyes. But the palace was for the ceremony, and the ceremony would be watched by the entire kingdom. Mara was led to the bridal chamber, where the veil lay folded like a secret waiting to be told. It was heavier than she expected, sewn with golden threads and tiny pearls catching light like slow stars. Her reflection in the mirror startled her. The plain woman she had known seemed softened less by the gold and more by the slow grace that happens when something is made sacred. Rowan arrived a moment later, the king in black embroidered with silver, his face set to a calm he had practiced for public viewing. But when Mara turned, their eyes caught and something passed between them, a quiet reckoning that this was no small mistake and no casual union. The procession to the great hall moved like a slow river. Torches held steady. Musicians played notes that smelled like rain. When they reached the dais, Rowan stood tall and spoke words that had been practiced by generations, but felt for him like a rope thrown across an abyss. The priest intoned. The rings slid on. Promises were said. There was a moment, one slender, suspended moment, when the veil would be lifted and the bride unveiled. The court leaned in with a breath that was almost audible. The noble ladies held their fans like shields, and even the servants paused to watch. Rumors had speculated for weeks about the bride. Would she be radiant? Would she be a shadow? The entire kingdom wanted to see what the king had chosen. Rowan reached for the veil. The crowd held its breath. He drew it aside. Mara did not become a perfect blossom of beautified art. She did not turn into the gilded image the nobles had expected. What happened instead was subtler and more dangerous. Where the court had waited for spectacle, it found truth. Mara's face, plain but honest, was lit from within by something no jeweler could fashion. Her eyes, brown as the river and sun, were clear and steady, and the smile that came when she caught Rowan's gaze was fearless and open. It was not the polished beauty songs praised. It was a beauty that had been tempered by sorrow and warmed by laughter. It was a beauty that belonged to a woman who had learned how to stand upright when life had tried to lay her flat. Shock swept the hall. Some noble ladies flapped their hands in disbelief. Beneath the laughter and the whispered commentary, something else unfolded. Rowan's stern jaw dropped in a private, quiet astonishment. He felt, in that instant, the weight of an old loneliness lifting the smallest degree. It was as if the world rearranged its furniture to fit this new truth. The years that followed did not unfold like a mythic romance with constant poetry and a forever sustained ardor. They were steadier, a cadence like hearth steps and weather. Their married life, the real trial, was built of daily acts and small surprises. Mara was not content to merely fit herself to courtly life. She brought with her the smell of bread and the grace of mending. At first, the court bristled at her disregard for ornate decorum. Her hands left flour on the throne room stair. She asked blunt questions about where taxes went and why children in certain hamlets had no winter coats. The nobles called her impertinent, while the servants found in her someone who remembered their names and the small details of their homes. She made friends with cooks and stable hands. She listened to complaints about broken windows and withheld wages, and she took to writing letters to the steward on behalf of the poor. Rowan watched these things with both pride and discomfort. Pride because she was not what the court expected. Discomfort because each act of honesty she performed pulled at the threads of aristocratic custom. Politics, too, would not remain polite. Neighboring lords watched the marriage with starved attention. Some attempted to undermine Rowan's choices, whispering that a king softened by common affection would become unsteady in council. Yet Mara, in her quiet way, learned the chess of court, how to say yes without giving away the king's position, how to use a simple anecdote to temper a harsh policy. Rowan found that her plainness was a kind of clarity. She had no time for falsehood, and that made even her small counsel sharp where others' silvered speech could be round and dishonest. As years turned, the people of Athris began to notice changes that could be measured. Grain was stored more carefully to withstand bad winters. A fund was created to repair roofs of widows. Healers in remote villages were given medicines. These were not extravagant initiatives. They were small, practical, expensive in the subtle currency of priority. A construction plan for a modest infirmary began in the market town. The nobles grumbled that the throne was handing power to the commons through influence. The commons, for once, felt considered. Love, when it grows from the soil of shared labor rather than the fireworks of immediate passion, changes shape. Rowan's love for Mara deepened through late-night conversations over ledgers and letters, through a shared joke over a burnt pot. Through the private hurt he revealed one winter afternoon when heavy rain hit the north wall and he confessed a memory of a child he had once lost to fever. Mara did not fix the past for him. She sat with him as he spoke, her silence proving more intimate than any attempt to smooth his pain. They began to sleep with their hands tangled. In the quiet of the private chambers, they learned each other's habits, the lines to avoid, the small hobbies that caused laughter. But such a love, though deep, drew jealous storms. One noble family house, Vereen, decided to test the king's resolve. They forged documents suggesting the Larksong House had secret claims to land near the capital worth fortune and raw influence. They suggested Mara's father had once been involved in petty crimes. Rumors, once sown, grew like weeds. The court took on a bitter undertone, and the king faced pressure to renounce the queen an unthinkable, uprooting of what had become their shared life. Rowan refused to be driven by rumor. He demanded truth through fair inquiry. When the Vereen forged documents were exposed clumsy handwriting errors and an over-reliance on bribed witnesses, the court was shamed. Yet the seeds of distrust left marks. Some nobles retreated, but others bided their time. Then came the trial of the midwinter plague, a narrow and bright winter when disease crept like a pale fog through outlying villages. It hammered the king and queen's mettle. The royal physician reported a shortage of medicines and a need for isolation wards. Nobles hosted banquets as if unaware. The markets emptied as fear spread. Mara moved like a lighthouse. She organized volunteer nurses, worked at the infirmary into the black of night, arranged for lords to supply grain rather than hoard it. And most dangerously, she rode forth into plague-shadowed hamlets to see conditions with her own eyes. Rowan insisted on accompanying her when danger shadowed too close to the palace gates. He would not allow her to be a martyr to sentiment. He wanted, perhaps for the first time, to stake himself publicly and privately. The people watched as the king lifted baskets, tended to the weak, and this was new. A queen stood at his elbow, not like a trophy, but like someone with calloused hands and unshowy courage. The plague invaded fewer lives than expected, and thanks to their quick measures, fewer bodies were lost than the old nightmares predicted. Something else happened during that winter, something tender and human. A young boy, orphaned by fever, attached himself to Mara. He would follow her through corridors and sleep at the infirmary's back door, his hair still stuck with the memory of illness. Mara, who could not refuse grief, took him into the royal household as if the king's compassion must be matched with hers. Rowan, who had also lost a child years before and hidden away the ache like a locked chest, found himself teaching the boy to read on stormy afternoons. They named the boy Thomas. He was small and stubborn and full of questions. His presence braided two previously separate threads of loss into something warmer. Time softened more than just grief. It brought rivalry that would explode into open scandal. A young noblewoman, Lady Evadne, had been spurned in favor of marriage to a foreign lord and grew bitter. She had a lover and a deputy steward, and when they discovered an inheritance in an old ledger that might belong to House Larksong, they engineered a preposterous but dramatic plan to take the boy Thomas and claim him as the king's illegitimate child. A ploy meant to shame the queen and destabilize the royal household. They would, in their gamble, expose the king to the court's scorn and make him doubt his wife. They struck in the dead of a pale spring. Thomas vanished from the palace for a sunless day. Panic was immediate and fingers pointed at the queen's disregard. Miriam, a loyal kitchen maid, suspected evading the steward and followed their trail to a damp cottage. The confrontation was messy in public. Accusations flashed like knives. When the boy was found, pale and frightened but safe, Evadne and her accomplice accused the queen of negligence publicly, and for a breath Rowan's stoic face cracked. He paced the courtyard like a man who felt his kingdom slipping between his hands in the heat of humiliation. When insults reigned and the court demanded justice, Rowan did something that shocked the crowds, rather than silent retribution. He invited Evadne to a public hearing and listened. The woman, who had expected ridicule, heard a king ask quiet, precise questions. He did not roar. He demanded clarity, and in that demand, a curious thing happened. The real motives were exposed like thinly veiled garments. Evadne's bitterness, once given air, shrank under the king's attention. He did not humiliate her in return. He offered mercy in the form of truth, a generous, public pardon in exchange for the prince, for Thomas, now a child of the court, being adopted into a small guardianship that included a school stipend. The spectacle of mercy sent tremors through the court and bankrolled a new rumor, that perhaps this king wore mercy like armor more effective than steel. Rowan and Mara's intimacy, meanwhile, was not untested. Mara, the plain woman with an honest hand, sometimes burned with insecurity. She found the court's whispers like a corrosive acid, small words that, over months, could gnaw away at the biggest rocks. One night she told Rowan that she felt like an imposter among the polished glass of the palace. She feared being loved for the kindness she offered and not for any intrinsic worth. Rowan held her. He told her a story he had told only once before, in half-lights to no one, about a boy sleeping beneath an apple tree who had dreamed that he would one day be a king. The boy had woken to find the tree broken, a branch had fallen, and the apples lay bruised. He had realized, as a child, that kingship and perfection were illusions. The only truth was tending the broken things. Mara laughed then, a soft, full sound that reached the edges of his heart. It was enough, that laugh, to feel like home. The years folded into something like peace. Thomas grew into a bright, curious youth who could find joy in a small stone and stubbornly read maps by candlelight. Mara's hands were no longer hidden. They had left prints on palace curtains and on the small constructs of policy that softened the kingdom's edges. Rowan, who had been raised to wear solitude like linen, had grown into a man who could seek solace with another's head against his shoulder. He found his counsel and his combat less important than the simple, daily habit of being present to a woman who would not be swayed by flattery. One summer, when a drought threatened the border villages, Rowan received a shocking message. The northern noble lords intended to raise troops, citing border raids as cause. The court leaned toward war. Many saw this as a chance for the king to show decisive strength. Mara, who had recently returned from supervising a new irrigation project by the river, listened to the council debates and found their arguments full of hot air and colder prophets. She stepped into the council chamber uninvited, clasped her hands, and spoke the blunt truth she had learned in fields. Men and horses die for pride and for grain alike. Are we willing to spill blood for harvest we can still save with water? At first, the council laughed. Then they scoffed. Then, to everyone's wonder, Rowan let her speak. She outlined plans practical, humble to redirect water, to negotiate fresh supply lines, to offer temporary subsidies to farmers. It was not glamorous policy, it was work. Rowan watched the faces of his ministers when his queen spoke plain and precise. The result was not immediate. The northern threat cooled not through saber, but through negotiation and an honest, common-sense plan that saved harvest and lives. The nobles grumbled in small rooms, but the markets studied. For the people in the fields, the name of their queen became a thing spoken with gratitude, as decades often do. Life moved toward an inevitable quiet, the slow erosion of youthful flames into a steady hearth. Rowan and Mara now shared a private language of glances. They had disagreements, of course, about where to allocate a modest fund, or whether to accept a certain foreign envoy's gift, but their quarrels ended quickly in compromise or apology. Old age, when it came for Rowan, arrived as a pale winter. He was not taken by dramatic illness or sudden treachery. Rather, time softened his frame and made his step shorter. The people told stories about when the king still rode into the night, but now he preferred to sit by Mara's window as dusk folded its blanket over the valley. He would watch the river and sometimes speak of small victories, of roofs mended, of a school founded, of Talmas who had married a teacher from a border town. Mara, whose hair had taken the silver of quiet years, would laugh sometimes and point out something ridiculous in the neighboring hedge dot in the last weeks of Rowan's life. They retreated to a small arbor the royal gardeners had carved into a private courtyard. There the two sat and held hands. Rowan, no longer the armored man, but a figure softened by mortality, told Mara bad jokes he kept for her all the years, and she, with a mind as sharp as ever, corrected him with warm scolding. They had the comfort of private rituals, bread shared at dawn, a calloused hand warmed in another dot once. When the lights slanted like gold leaf and the air smelled of late roses, Rowan spoke of the day he had drawn back the veil. Everyone expected spectacle, he said. They were waiting to see whether I had made a wise alliance or a foolish one. I thought I would give them a pageant. Instead, I got a life. You gave me a life, too, Mara answered, voice steady. You gave me the courage to be human, he said, to make mistakes out loud. When death visited quietly, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon as the sun angled through leaves, Mara felt the world inhale and hold its breath. Rowan's chest slowed, then finished. Her sob was small but broken, like a ceramic cup. The funeral made no dramas beyond the ache that the people felt. He was a king, but he had been a husband and a man who had, through a marriage that 1,000 tongues, had once mocked reordered the small moral economy of a realm. People came to the palace not to cast accusations, but to lay flowers and to remember. Children made crowns of daisies and left them on the steps. Thomas, now grown, held Mara's hand like an anchor. Mara lived on, because living had always been her practice. The palace kept its quiet order. The infirmary continued its work. The little fund for widows and children persisted because a woman of plain hands would not allow it to die. She spent more afternoons in the market, less in the high halls. She taught children to sew and to read under the same apple tree where Rowan had once dreamed of kingship. She spoke to them of mercy and practice, of the hard truth that lasting change came not from edicts, but from the patient labor of neighbors. She never again drew a veil in public. But sometimes, rare and private, she would stand before a simple mirror and run her hand over the small silver thread in her hair and smile. It was not a smile for triumph, but for the stitched-together life of quiet courage. When travelers came to Athos, they told the same story in different tongues. The king who had been supposed to marry to secure an alliance, instead had found a woman who taught him the value of tending broken things. She, who had been called an ugly duckling by the malicious tongues of the court, had become the swan whose calm wings had steadied a kingdom. And the legend of King Rowan and Queen Mara changed not because they had lived without flaw, but because they had found in the ordinary an extraordinary fidelity to each other, to the people who did not have banners, and to the belief that kindness, not spectacle, could be the strongest crown of all. Years later, children still ran around the palace gardens and argued over which stories were true. Some said Mara had always been beautiful in a way that mattered most to one that did not fade. Others said the king had been wise to choose her. Thomas, with children of his own now, would sometimes sit on the palace steps and tell those who would listen the truth. It was never about beauty or shame. It was about choosing to be brave when no one watched, and kind when it counted. And that was enough.